We are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar on plants and urban I would say urban green space areas, focusing on plants and plant management in those areas. Joining me behind the scenes, we have Noah Truesdell with ISWEP, and he's going to hop in case we have any technical issues. And we also have Tom Rosburg from Drake University. You guys are all familiar with him. So as usual, what we're going to do is we're going to start playing the video. And for this session, we are in Ames, Iowa. And we're starting at Ada Hayden Park, which is on the north central side of the city of Ames. And then we'll head to Brookside Park, which is closer to the campus of Iowa State University. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started with the video. So what we do is we start and stop. And if you have any questions, please feel free, and Tom will discuss certain aspects and we'll keep going here. Hi, this is Pat Sauer, Executive Director of the Iowa Stormwater Education Partnership, and we are here in Ada Hayden Park to take a look at some of the areas in the park. Joining me is
Tom Rosburg from Drake University.
And Joshua Thompson with the City of Ames Parks and Recreation Department.
Okay, here we go. We're going to start our journey.
Well, good morning. As Pat Sauer said, we're out here at Ada Hayden Heritage Park, one of our 38 parks here at the City of Ames. We're actually at the south end of Ada Hayden Lake, and what we're here is a 3.5 acre plot of land that has been designated as an oak savanna restoration. We started this project back in 2015. We brought in the Conservation Corps, heavily infested with honeysuckle, buckthorn, and other non-native noxious weeds. They came in. We took out truckloads and truckloads, treated the stumps of those species, and continued restoration up until now. And during those times, we brought in some goats. We've done some grazing on this property. We're still waiting to find the conducive conditions to burn, but that's our goal, to get it burned yet this fall. But as you can see, there's a lot of mature oak species, but there's also some other hardwoods or other basswoods in this that need to probably be removed. But so this is a continual effort. Like I said, we've been started in 2015 and continue to work on it. The reason why this was designated as an oak savanna is obviously the species on this hillside are oaks. The Friends of Ada Hayden Heritage Park, a friends group that's very active in the management of this park, developed a management plan, and they took every area of the park and dissected it into different sections. And this section they designated as an oak savanna. So we're using cultural methods and some chemical methods to try to treat this area to try to make sure to restore it back to its original habitat.
Can you tell us about any challenges with having the goats here and maybe movement or introduction of other species that may have occurred?
Yeah, no, the goats were brought in to kind of a natural cultural method to remove some of the non-native species. But one of the things that happened was specifically burdock. Burdock became a huge problem because they wouldn't eat the burdock, and the seeds were sticking to their fur and were spreading throughout this area. So we did the goats for a couple sessions and realized they were doing some good. They did knock some of the non-native species back, but they also did create some other issues for us, which we had to take care of later.
Well, yeah, I really want to commend Josh and the City of Ames for taking on this project, because savanna restoration is really important. You know, it's really hard to find anything in Iowa yet that remotely resembles what a really true savanna was like on the native landscape. And, you know, Josh is right. I mean, we have the evidence of a savanna here in the oaks. When you can see these large, formally spreading, you can see in some cases they've lost the lower limbs, but I bet if you looked at a 1930 era photo, and maybe we can do that for the webinar, look at a 1930 era photo for this area, we would see just a scattering of large trees on this north-facing slope. North-facing slopes were common places for a savanna on the native landscape because of the reduction in fire intensity as fire burned across the prairie and burned downslope. The intensity of the fire would decrease, the flames would become less high, less intense, the fire would become more patchy because of more moist fuel conditions and less light, cooler type of environment. The heat from the fire is going behind the fire rather than in front of the fire as fire burns its way downhill. So uh, you can see this across the Iowa landscape in many, many places, north and northeast facing slopes especially, are places where we see these really large oaks. And so no doubt there was a savanna here, and to bring a savanna back, you really have to have the trees. And so the trees are here. You can't replace these trees, unless you got like 200 years or so. So you got to have the trees, but the herbaceous layer is completely gone, of course. What used to be the savanna, because of the encroachment of woody vegetation, other tree species, and then of course the honeysuckle that Josh was talking about, the understory is completely changed. So that's the challenge now, of course, opening this up. And they've got a good start by taking out the honeysuckle. That is a tremendous job right there. Many of you probably have seen places where honeysuckle is just like a wall. And so that's an important job, and making, of course, sure that that honeysuckle is not coming back. And so continuing to work on any honeysuckle coming up from the seed bank. But now, again, the reed canary grass and other plants we're going to be seeing here, are not indicative of a savanna. They need to be more prairie-like. So first of all, we need more light. We've got to start by getting the honeysuckle out, but now many of these larger trees need to come out. There's box elders, there's basswoods, there's elms, there's green ash, whole number of variety of tree species that, again, would not have been on a savanna. Those, if you truly want to say you're doing a savanna restoration project, then those species really need to come out. There's a black cherry right there, for example, another black cherry there. So I know that can be kind of hard, taking out those large trees. You got to do something with them. A lot of times the public doesn't like to see trees come out, but committed to savanna restoration, then you really need to be thinking about opening up the canopy to what my definition of a savanna is, and this will vary among ecologists, but my definition of a savanna is going to be anywhere from 10 to about 35% canopy cover. So if we're looking down on top of it from a bird's eye view, the canopy trees are only occupying no more than 1/3, basically, of the land area. And if we were to look at this now from the top, probably easily 60%, 70%. So there's quite a few trees that need to come out. And in fact, probably even some oak trees. And that, again, can be hard. I can see a cluster of 5 oaks right up there close together. Probably taking 1 or 2 of those out. Because if you really want to get young oaks like these right here in front of us to continue to grow and develop to replace the larger oaks 100 years down the road or so, they're going to need to have more light and more room. So, and by opening it up to that canopy cover of 10 to 35%, you are really opening it up to, again, being more like a prairie. And that, of course, is the type of vegetation that we want to see in here, more of those prairie plants, those light-loving plants. So that's to me, that's the goal. It takes a while to get there, but you got to start by getting rid of the honeysuckle, and that's a good start.
Tom, where are we headed next?
We're going to walk up this slope a little bit and just see what we can see for plants up in there. Um, all right, now we're just looking at a bunch of reed canary grass for the most part down here in the lower slope. There are some native sedges here. These sedges along the edge here are cone sedge, which is really more a sedge meadow species. So they may be indicative of sort of what used to be here at the bottom of this slope would have been maybe a sedge meadow coming out into here. Of course, this has all changed with the quarry in the lake now. But yeah, let's take a walk up. We'll start again up the slope here a ways and see what kind of plants we can find.
Some of the challenges that we encounter as public property abuts private property is individuals or homeowners parkland. When this property was developed, this whole Ada Hayden was developed, there was a conservation easement that was set up for lands directly to the south of Ada Hayden. Individuals that had a large area of oak species and was included in the easement, and the easement basically prohibits individuals from doing any type of cutting, trimming, cutting, or mowing, those types of typical management practices that you'd see on private property without written permission from the city of Ames. And typically, we have not given a ton of information or a ton of permission to do that unless a tree would become a risk tree or a hazard type of situation. As I come out here and have multiple conversations with these homeowners, some of them are compliant, some of them are not compliant. And so it's continually working with these homeowners to that they understand the stipulations that are set out on the easement, but also education of why we're doing what we're doing, the benefits of the species that we have here, the benefits of the land here, and trying to keep it natural the way it was, but also manage it effectively. So those are things that we deal with. It's a constant battle. Most of the time when you educate these individuals, they really, really appreciate it. But sometimes it continues to be reinforced.
Let's take a look at some of the herbaceous species we have here. We're in a pretty dense cover here. I would say it's at least 75, 80% canopy cover right here. So really more of a forest right here. But the herbaceous layer is pretty open. So here again, the removal of the honeysuckle has been effective. There's a few burdock plants still present in places. Josh talked about that and the challenges they had there with the goats. There are some honeysuckle plants, not right here, but a little bit further away. And so there's always going to be a continued need, of course, to watch for those invasive species. They've done a good job of clearing them out here, but they will come back if you're not vigilant and keep on top of it. So the native species that we have right in front of me down here, first of all, let's look at the sedge, this grass-like plant that we see growing all through here. This is Pennsylvania sedge. My clue to that is just the amount that we're seeing here, a large patch of it. Pennsylvania sedge often grows in these large patches. If you pull up a little bit of the plant, you have to get right down to the base. You see this reddishness at the base of the stems here. That is a good characteristic for Penn sedge as well. And they're just a really fine leaves. This is great because this is a great fuel to carry fires then through the forest or the savanna. You need to have these grass-like plants, sedges or grasses, to provide that fine fuel, though, to be able to support a fire. Some other things that we see here quite abundantly are this plant right here. There's lots of stems here, so I'll just pull one up here. So this one, looking at the shape of the leaves, the pretty acuminate tips out here, this is starry Solomon seal. So starry Solomon seal is Myanthemum stellatum. It's more related to fall Solomon seal than it is to Solomon seal. I think this is a pretty good example again of a plant that would have been found in open woodlands or savannas on a native landscape. There's a pretty good colony of it growing here. Another one that I think is somewhat indicative of a more open woodland or savanna is this one right here. This is red columbine. And then the other things we're seeing here, the white snake root. That's this one up here. And I saw some white avens. That's this one right here with the flower, white flowers right here in front of us. Those are more forest species, so again, more shaded environments. So I think you know, what one needs to think about or keep their options open is, even though this probably was a savanna, again, we can look at soils to see what the soils say. Um, Soils would be like a transitional soil between a prairie and a forest. Soil scientists map transitional soils and name them separate names. And so a transitional soil is this idea of a soil that has some characteristics that indicate more of a prairie-like environment, but also has some characteristics indicate more of a forest environment. It has beginning of an E horizon, for example. So those transitional soils are considered to be probably soils that formed under a savanna or maybe an open woodland. So again, in this gradient from prairie to forest, as trees increase in occurrence on the landscape and get more common, density goes up, canopy cover goes up. From 0 to 10% is prairie or grassland. There can be a few trees, and we can still call it a prairie. From 10 to 35 is savanna, as I described. From 35% to 65% canopy cover is woodland. And so an open woodland would be as the savanna is becoming more encroached by trees and filling in a little bit more, it's going to transition to that. An open woodland basically is from 35 to 50%. A woodland, again, is this ecosystem that straddles 50%. Goes again from 35 to 65. Once you get above 65% canopy cover, then we call that a forest. So I think, again, in Iowa's native landscape, we had primarily woodlands, except in the most deep ravines and deepest valleys, the most fire protected parts of the landscape. That's where we would have had some forest. But for the most part, our wooded systems were woodlands. And I think it's important, you know, to distinguish a woodland from a forest then. Woodlands means that again, there is a more of an open nature to it. There's more light, um, and it's again this system that would straddle 50% canopy cover. So if a savanna restoration, you know, getting down to 10 to 35% canopy cover is just too difficult in terms of the amount of energy, the cost, because here again, we're talking taking out quite a few more trees. And again, lots of these trees could come out. The basswoods here around us are all young. They're probably certainly you know, not much older than 20 or 30 years old. So there's trees that can come out, but again, I think maybe you might not have to take very many oaks out, but a few oaks out to get down to at least 35%. But if that again is too difficult and too much of a transition and just too much of a cost, then shoot for a woodland. Go from what was a forest or still is a forest, you know, to a woodland. And an open woodland would be, you know, the closest thing to a savanna. And that would provide, again, more of an environment that would at least invite some of those prairie species that would have been here.
Now we're
Okay, so I guess what we'll do is I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint that has information on we'll look at the aerial photos and Tom will discuss them, and then also we'll take a look at soils. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and as usual, too many things are pulled up. Okay, I'll go full screen. Okay, go ahead, Tom.
All right. Well, thank you, Pat. So as I mentioned out there when we were doing the video, it'd be nice to take a look at the 1930 or 50 aerial photos and soil maps to help us understand what the native landscape was most likely like. You know, we can go back to 1930 on these aerial photos. You know, it'd be nice if we could go back further, but we can't. But going back to 1930 puts us back, well, you know, we're getting close to almost 100 years ago now, and certainly in 1930, there's much more of oh, um, a look to the landscape that again approximates what the native landscape was like, especially with the amount of trees. You're not going to, again, see that much prairie in 1930s aerial photos, but what I like to use those old photos for is trying to understand what the situation is with the trees. And so in this 1930 aerial photo, the red circle there is the site that we were standing on. That is the site right there. You can see to the north up here, you can see the name Ada Hayden Lake. Obviously, again, in 1930, there was no lake or quarry there. That was all fields. But if you look at those trees, they certainly do represent what I would call sort of a savanna woodland complex or combination. Those trees on the right there are a little more dense. And again, the wooded vegetation, the trees, the tree ecosystems on the native landscape would have been fairly complex in terms of trying to separate out, a forest from a woodland, from a savanna. But and in many places, even if you go over there to the right and just look along the Skunk River, again, we see far fewer trees over there than what there are now. That represents, again, more of a combination of savanna with maybe some small woodland patches. So again, I think the 1930s era photo does suggest that this was certainly much more open and savanna-like. The gray areas in here would have probably been prairie plants, although, again, hard to say for sure from the aerial photo. This was likely just pastured, this north-facing slope. I mean, this is in 1930. It's clear that it wasn't plowed and being farmed at that point. So, and if we go forward from here, we see that it never looks like that. Here's 1970. And you can see in 40 years how much drastic change has occurred here in the amount of trees. The density of trees has gone up a huge amount. This is clearly a forest now. In 1930, it was not really a forest, but it is now. And it has been a forest ever since. So that forest environment has been there for 50 years at least. And so you would expect that the understory is certainly going to be much more forest-like now. It's surprising that we did even find, some of those species like the starry, and starry false Solomon seal is the better name there. I kind of misspoke when I said starry Solomon seal because Myanthemum is the genus for that plant. And again, the Myanthemums are the false Solomon seals. Polygonatum is a true Solomon seal. But yeah, the starry false Solomon seal and the red columbine, Pennsylvania sedge that we saw there is a forest species, although I kind of think of it probably more of a woodland species, even maybe a closed woodland. But here again, we can see that it's no wonder that the understory, has changed so dramatically with the amount of forest cover that we see here. And of course, the understory got completely filled in. We can't see a picture of this, but Josh, I think adequately explained, the amount of honeysuckle that they pulled out of their truckloads. The understory was probably just full of it, and so that even would have impacted the herbaceous layer even more. So I think we've got a soils map too. So okay, here's a just a more recent aerial photo, right?
Yes.
Not sure
Yep.
what
Yep.
year this is, but now we can see the quarry there, of course, the lake, and again, the area we were looking at there, that's the same area in all three of these aerial photos. Again, very much of a forest there. If we pull up a soil map, now we're looking at, again, where this red circle is up here. This is a soil map that has these map unit codes, 236. If we go back just one, maybe quick. So if you have to read this number down here, you look in these polygons and look for these little numbers. There's a 236F there. That's what this polygon is. It kind of occupies most of that area, most of that slope. And so if we go to 236, which is the next slide, we can see 236 here on the left. Is a Lester soil. And so here's a map unit description of a Lester soil. 236 is the map unit code for it. It is a soil that formed in glacial tail. It's actually associated with the moraine deposits that are left from the glacier. It's lot of information about the Leicester soil. The thing that is of interest to us is, and it's not really given, I don't think, on this little pull down description here. If you go to the soil website, or excuse me, the NRCS soil description site, you can pull up information on each of the soils, and you'll get this kind of information. But you also get what the current vegetation is like and what the soil scientists believe the native vegetation was like. Again, the soil scientists are making a judgment on what the native vegetation was like based on the characteristics that they see in the present day soil. And of course, what's so important about that is that the present day soil does reflect the vegetation that was present while that soil was forming over hundreds of years. And even though the vegetation that was present when that soil was forming, we call that the native vegetation, now is completely gone because of land use, that soil is still going to retain those characteristics. It's not going to change, in just a few years. It's going to retain those same characteristics. And so that in that way, it's possible to look at soils and essentially make a map of what the native vegetation was. I do that all the time. If you read in on the other website what the use and vegetation is for the Leicester soil, it says most areas are cultivated. So that says that most of these areas did get changed completely to farmland, where corn and soybeans are grown. Some areas are pasture land. So those are the ones that helps. That's the use, of course, helped those trees survive. That remnant savanna conditions could survive if it was being pastured. And it says some areas are pasture land and some are forest. Well, yeah, some are forest because they've succeeded from what they used to be. The final sentence in this description I'm reading is the native vegetation is savanna. The soil scientists are saying outright they believe. Now, what their definition of savanna is, of course, may not be the same as mine, but at least we're both in agreement that it wasn't forest and it probably wasn't prairie. It was some type of prairie-like environment that had a few large trees, because again, that's everyone's definition of savanna is something like that. It is important, and I mentioned this in the video, that not every ecologist's definition of savanna is the same by far. The definition I use, the one that I gave there, 10 to 35% canopy cover, um, those limits are kind of my own, but if you look at the Prairie Restoration Handbook, there's a nice diagram in there that I use in a lot of my PowerPoints that shows, it just helps to convey the concept that a better way of thinking about the native landscape was this continuum of woody vegetation, basically from zero amount of woody vegetation to very little, we call that a prairie, and then increasing amounts of woody vegetation because of decreasing intensity and frequency of fire. And as we go into those types of environments where fire became less and less and less common, we move into a savanna, and then we move into a woodland, and then we move into a forest. So that book does, I think, do a great job of at least showing the idea that a woodland and a forest are not the same thing to many ecologists. Woodland is the same thing as forest to many other people, though. That woodland term is used interchangeably with forest by lots and lots of people who do not distinguish the difference there. And again, I think the importance and why I brought it up in the video is that if it's a woodland environment, that implies that there's a dependency on fire. There is a dependency on fire there. It doesn't have very frequent fires, but there is the need for surface fires in order to keep that woodland as a woodland and not let it succeed to a forest. So what we're seeing here is the soils and the aerial photos certainly both corroborate this idea that slope we were on, if you're going to aim for restoration and you're truly trying to aim towards what the native landscape was like, then savanna or open woodland would be what you should be trying to do.
And I was going to hop in on the soil side of this, and looking at the characteristics of this typical soil profile. If there's woodland, forest, and I'm not as much familiar with soil profiles under savanna, I would assume it would be the same. There are names for soils, like a forest type soil, woodland would be called an alpha sol. And an alpha sol, while looking at these soil horizons, typically would have what's called an E horizon. I won't get into a lot of details. Versus your prairie soils, they're called mollisols, and those soil profiles typically would have an A, B, and C horizon, and you would not see an E horizon. So additional information that can be obtained from a soil survey.
That's right, and I think it's the beginning of an E horizon, probably. I'm not a soil scientist. So I'm not quite sure what criteria they may be using, but certainly the idea that they're standing in a place that has because of the vegetation, there was some influence of woody vegetation. There was a big influence of herbaceous vegetation. There's this kind of combination. That's why it's called a transitional type of soil. It's transitioning from a prairie to a more of a forest type of environment. So that E horizon that we see here in the Lester, again, is indicative, is probably an important part of their interpretation, and they're again deciding to call this something that was a savanna. I think in a forest vegetation, E horizon probably would be more developed, and A horizon would be less. So yeah,
Yep.
that's right. They're looking at the A and the E horizon, probably in some way to try to determine, again, where they are in that gradient.
Yep. Okay. Well, and at this point in time, we pause. Does anyone have any questions or comments or experiences they may want to share? I'll have to stop sharing my screen so that I can look at so I can look at the chat area. Let's see. So this is from Paige. So I'm assuming savannas are scarce these days because the trees were either cleared completely for fields or they were too thick to clear and are now overrun woodlands. That's one question. Maybe we'll address that first and then I'll read the second part.
Well, she's exactly right. So savannas are extremely. A savanna is more rare than prairie because, again, they're in this very tenuous situation where they require a certain amount of fire. And right, some of them were completely cleared of the trees and have been turned into agricultural fields. So again, those large oak trees were cut down and removed. If that didn't happen, then what often happened, as I was saying, is that those areas were grazed. They were used for pasture. So the trees remain; those large oak trees still remain, but the understory and the herbaceous layer is just completely gone because in using it for pasture, there was probably an attempt to improve it for pasture. There was herbicide applied. There was fertilizer applied. There were non-native forage grasses brought in. Just the idea of grazing it with cattle. The cattle could have brought in, again, seed from non-native grasses as well. That herbaceous layer just completely transitioned to basically what a pasture is. You've got a pasture with large oak trees. And then what can also happen, well, that's probably the best scenario that we can envision having to work with. If that's what you got, then you've probably got the best hope. Obviously, if it was cultivated and the trees were removed, like I said, you can begin a savanna restoration, but you're going to be waiting 200 years to get trees that are the right size to actually have it look like one. So that's a long ways off. You got to have those trees. I mean, so if you're going to do savanna restoration, having a site that still retains the large spread crown trees is very important, because what often happens is, even if it was pastured, it may have not been pastured or managed very well, or it maybe became unnecessary for the landowner to pasture it. What then happens, or could happen next, and did happen, a lot of them, was that the understory closed in with lots of invasive honeysuckle and buckthorn, other species. And so now you've really got a dramatic change in that structure of that system, and you got a dramatic change to the herbaceous layer because there's a whole lot more shading. At least if it was a what I call a cool season non-native savanna. That's a pasture, a cool season grassland, basically with large oak trees on it. At least it's still got the openness there to support herbaceous vegetation. It's being managed to keep those woody invasives out, because the landowner wants to, of course, use it for forage, and so there's incentive to do that. That's a lot better, of course, than what the city of Ames had to deal there with. But yeah, so it's I mean, I can't even think of really a place that you can go and see what I would call, a really, really good example of savanna, because they've all been so dramatically changed. Now there are some fairly good examples that have been under renovation for a long time. I use the term renovation as a way of talking about a form of restoration that involves taking a degraded remnant and renovating it, basically using management practices to help improve it and bring those native species back. Because again, if you're working with a remnant, that's different than starting from scratch. But there are some sites. There's some good work being done at Yellow Banks County Park, on the southeast side of Des Moines. There's again, you can at least get a bit of a feel of a savanna there because of the openness, and at least some prairie vegetation growing in the herb layer. Bill and Sibylla Brown down in Decatur County have been doing a lot of work on their woodland and savannas both, and those look pretty good. So there are some, but you're right, they are among the rarest of our native systems.
Okay. And the rest of Paige's question, didn't we also discuss last time that the forest floor isn't supposed to be 4 foot tall and have an excuse me, have an overgrown appearance that we see very commonly?
Okay, so when we say 4 foot tall, you're talking about the herbaceous layer being that tall, I guess, just to clarify.
She is typing.
Oh,
correct.
Okay. Um, well, that will depend a lot, I think, on the type of forest. Certainly in floodplain forests, alluvial soils that are pretty fertile, it would not be uncommon to have an herbaceous layer that is 4 foot tall. There are a lot of plants that are forest herbaceous species. That's where they belong. That can usually grow, 3 to 4 feet tall. Green coneflower is a great example. That's Rudbeckia laciniata. A real common plant, of course, and not one of our favorites, but in those alluvial forests is wood nettle, and I've certainly encountered plenty of that. So it would all really depend upon the type of forest, how rich that soil was, what the soil moisture and nutrient levels, would be. Again, lower lying alluvial soils, you would normally expect to see that kind of thing. If you're up on an upland, then it would be different, of course. A thinner soil, upland slopes, especially a south or west upland forest slope, those you would never expect to see that kind of herb layer there. You'd maybe 2 feet. Most plants would probably grow to a height of about 2 feet, and that'd probably be about it. And there'd be a lot of plants that would be even much smaller than that.
See, it looks like Paige is typing. Oh, okay, that all makes sense. Thank you.
Oh.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments, questions while we're on this part of the site at Ada Hayden?
Has anyone got a savanna?
Yeah, anyone have a savanna? Anyone, anyone.
Any kind of degraded savanna, at least something you can work with.
So Wayne Peterson once, I rode with him on the way to, it was in the Luss Hills, maybe on the way to Sioux City, I forget, or Council Bluffs, I forget. But he had indicated he had stopped at a couple spots that he thought were indicative of oak savanna.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh
in the
yeah,
western.
you bet. If you travel, everybody does travel Interstate 80, and especially if you go from Des Moines towards Council Bluffs on 80. I mean, I see this all the time. I always when I take that route, I always always try to uh, revisit my site as I'm driving by those areas. But you just got to watch, and especially if you're looking to the south, of course, you're looking at north-facing slopes, and you'll often see nice large grove of bur oak trees, occupying a north-facing slope, and it's in a pasture environment. You can see that it's a cool season grassland pasture. Again, is what saved them. But um, I think again, um, there would have been a lot of savanna and open woodland integrating with the prairie, especially in the Southern Iowa Drift Plain, because of the effect of those north and east facing slopes. Always going to promote a lower intensity, more creeping, somewhat more patchy fire that would allow for trees to survive. And you know, once the oak gets to a certain size, then it becomes harder for fire to hurt it or kill it because of the thicker bark. So um, yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, if you know what to look for, you can still look at our landscape, and you can kind of read the landscape and see you can see remnants, or a vestige of what that native landscape was.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Well, Noah, I think at this point in time, you can start up the video again.
On the other side of the Oak Savannah woodland area, on the lake bank side, and talk about a couple of things that how it was constructed, why it was constructed. So the whole point of it was to be able to see the lake, and it was constructed with and planted with native prairie species. But one of the things that's our issue is we've got some sandbar willow, we've got box elder, um, a lot of non-native species um, that have become challenges for us to try to manage. Individuals, like I said, like to want to walk on or ride on the path and see the lake, and we're continually fighting that. We also have, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, box elder, but the willows. This site was so disturbed prior to the park being established that we're still working with it, even 15 years later. So we're still working with it, and trying to manage a lot of these non-native species.
And Josh, can you tell us a little bit about the history? What was this before the park was established?
Yeah, so for many years, was owned by Hallett's. Hallett's, and it was called Hallett's Quarry, and so they mined sand and gravel out of this for many years. But as in the late 60s and 70s, that slowed down. There was a proposal by a developer in the late 90s, early 2000s to purchase this property to make it a development area, and it would have been a great development area for some of those people. But a group of individuals came together and said, "Hey, we need to preserve this land. We need to restore it back to its native." And so that's what happened. The city of Ames passed a bond issue, and over 80% of the individuals that voted for it voted yes, which is unheard of in any type of bond issue in any type of community. So this has been a great effort put on by the Friends of Ada Hayden Heritage Park and multiple other individuals throughout the city to get this park established. And there's been continued efforts for many years to continue to keep this going, and we're going to keep it going and keep managing it the way it's supposed to be managed for as long as we can. So.
All right, so Josh, one question I have, and I think this is a challenge for any land resource manager, is multiple use, right?
Yeah.
So there's lots of uses happening out here, and different factions of people will like Canada thistle, as you mentioned, because it provides seed for goldfinches, or they might find, the sandbar willow is great for a nice shrub thicket for birds to nest in or something. And you could probably go down the list and talk about dragonflies and
Yes.
insects and others.
Yes. Yes.
So, is that something that you try to factor into what you're trying to do here, or
Yeah, and
is that?
so like you said, we have multiple individuals that are very. That's the thing I've always noticed about the individuals. I'm not from Ames. I'm from west of here, but the thing I've always noticed about the residents of Ames, they're very. There's everybody's very passionate about very many different things, and so specifically at this park, there's so many individuals that are passionate about very diverse types of plants and species, and so um, trying to not necessarily please those individuals, but try to manage all of that is a challenge for us. And so that does enter in or as a factor in how we manage this park. But obviously there's some things that are kind of no. We're not going to compromise on. Noxious weeds. We're doing our best to get rid of those. It's the law, specifically musk thistle. We have a group of individuals that have harvested over 1,000 flower of musk thistle for many, many years. And if you go around the park, there's not a ton of musk thistle here. We have individuals that let us know about the Canada thistle, but we're trying to manage that as well as you said in regards to the birders wanting to keep that there as well. So, we do not touch tall thistle typically in the fall, as you see it later in the summer. So I've talked about a lot of thistle species, but one of the things that we're trying to take care of is ensure that individuals still have a view of the lake when people are exercising or just enjoying their time out here.
And the goal of this buffer strip would have been just to provide sort of a prairie-like environment, right?
Yeah.
As just a buffer strip between the lake and the trail here.
Yeah, and so it's
With prairie
every
species.
area or every this whole area is pretty heavily sloped. So we had to one of the unfortunate parts of managing the slope was it was seeded with native species, but in the seed bank or in the seed mix was crown vetch, and so we're fighting crown vetch right now. We're gonna hit it hard this fall, selectively, but that's been a challenge, and how crown vetch takes over everything. So that's one of the things that that we didn't have anything to do with, but it just comes in, and we're trying to manage that. So.
Right. The invasive species problem is always a big challenge, and yeah, the crown vetch, the Canada thistle, those are two big ones. The reed canary grass. Yeah, and each one of those species, of course, will probably require a different strategy, and so when you've got a mixture of them, that just makes things a lot harder.
Yeah, and then also communicating to the public, like, hey, we know we know some of these are issues, but also we have 37 other parks. We have a certain amount of money that we can spend at this in the park system, so we have to be able to manage those funds effectively. That's why the Friends of Ada Hayden Heritage Park have been such a great asset to our partnership with them, because they have provided some financial
some of the help.
and have
money and
yeah, exactly, and
labor.
also exactly. So
Good.
they've been really helpful in this. Here we are on the west side of Ada Hayden Heritage Park. It's, if you're familiar with Ames, it's right along Hyde Avenue, northwest part or straight north side of Ames. And what we're standing here in now is an area that was recently ceded to prairie in the summer of 2017. It was ceded with 55 different native prairie species. But prior to that, it was a hayfield. It was clover, and we contracted with an individual, and
Okay, we can pause at this point. We went over a little bit into the newly established area, but does anyone? Okay, so Jennifer does have a question on the buffer and one of the species that was there. What is the best way to take care of crown vetch in a prairie? I have also struggled with it and was just out with a landowner who had patches of it and some individual bunches of reed canary grass. Thoughts on management strategies?
All right. Well, I can speak from experience now with crown vetch. I manage a small privately owned prairie for the Raymond family north of Ames. It's actually just right to the west of Peterson Pits. If you stand down in Peterson Pits and look to the west, you can kind of see pieces of it up there on the slopes. And that prairie has been threatened by increasing amounts of crown vetch over the last several years. There used to be just small patches of it there going back 15 years, and I tried to manage it then, like you should, of course, right away when it's just kind of coming in. And I did do some herbicide spraying, but it wasn't sufficient apparently. Long story short, I probably didn't spend enough time there. Very busy person a lot of times in the summertime, so there were some years I didn't get there. But I've over the last 3 or 4 years been making a very strong effort to get that prairie back where it should be, because it's one of the best prairies in Story County. So the crown vetch problem has been getting worse there, and here's what I've learned over the last couple of years. My first thoughts were I want to do the least amount of collateral damage to the prairie, because it is a pretty high quality prairie. So what we've been doing there is the landowners have agreed to hire Conservation Corps crew, which is 4 or 5 people for at least one day, because again, it's too much for me to do by myself. And when they would come well, it would have been in 2020, 2020 and 2021, they came, and what I had them do, and I did as well, is we used brush cutters, and about middle of June or so, sometime from middle of June to July, just brush cut anything bad. And there's buckthorn is another bad species there. This prairie is just surrounded by a wall of buckthorn, so it's just a constant problem. So the buckthorn and the crown vetch were target by brush cutting, and brush cutting with steel brush cutters with steel blades. I'd tell the Conservation Corps crew to cut stuff off as low as possible. My goal was to try to stress both species. We're going to focus on crown vetch, but the crown vetch at a time when it's just coming into flower. And I think it was successful, and we were definitely stressing it by cutting it. And of course, when you're using a brush cutter, you can be somewhat selective. You can avoid cutting good things. That was the point of doing that as well. And then what I would do is I was going to come back in the fall and use an herbicide on the regrowth. Stressing it in the summer, and then coming back in the fall and stressing again with herbicide. But I was always choosing to come back pretty late, because I wanted, again, to try to make use of the senescence of prairie plants, allow senescence of prairie plants to occur, but get in that short window of time that the crown vetch is still green and pretty active beyond, the senescence time of prairie. So I was timing this. I'd have to look at my field notebook, but I think it was certainly late October or early November. And unfortunately, I found over the last couple of years that was not working very well. The crown vetch was still somewhat suppressed, but I was not getting rid of it. So I think the main reason probably was, thinking about it, looking back, I was probably spraying it too late. I recall spraying it again at that time, again, to avoid killing anything native, because the native plants would have been senesced. But I think the crown vetch was also senescing. It was still green somewhat, but it was probably shutting down. And I don't think the herbicide application was effective then because of that. So after trying that for 2 years, I decided I got to change. So this year, what we did when I had the Conservation Corps out is, and the crown vetch is getting serious there. I put flags. We used some wire flagging, and we flagged lanes going across the prairie, so that each person could occupy a lane with a backpack sprayer and be responsible for spraying that particular lane, which is about 6 to maybe 8 feet wide or so. We did that because I didn't want to miss anything. You just can't kind of wander around out there and expect to have the coverage that you need. So by making these lanes, we could systematically have, again, each person spray in their lane. And I explained to the Conservation Corps people, okay, we're just spraying these 3 species: crown vetch, show them what that looked like, buckthorn, and smooth sumac. And the sumac I wasn't too concerned about. Spray it if it's easy. Don't worry about it if there's some prairie plants that are surrounding it. And I really emphasized that this had to be done very carefully. We're trying to be surgeons here. We're trying to surgically remove these invasive species without damaging any other of the prairie plants, like a surgeon would do if you're having a surgery to fix something. They're going to be very, very careful and target what they need to do. And I think that helped, because the crew was very, worked very slowly. Took our time. We got the whole prairie covered in one day, and a lot of the time again was setting up these lanes. I sprayed it with an herbicide called Crossbow. This is a mixture of triclopyr and 2,4-D. Now, um, for a legume like that, another option would have been Milestone, but Milestone is more expensive, and I wasn't sure how well Milestone would work on the woody plants. I know now that it does work well, and so long story short, again, I went with Crossbow. It may not have been the ideal thing for the legumes, but as it turned out, it was. Uh, I went back to the prairie after about 2 weeks, and I could see very easily that the buckthorn that had been sprayed was definitely dying. I could see crown vetch dying. I was just there last week, and honest, I had a hard time even finding any crown vetch. And before, believe me, it was not hard to find crown vetch. There were large patches of it. And it was pretty easy to spray the crown vetch in the large patches because that was the only thing that was there. The places where I did find some crown vetch, smaller amounts of crown vetch, were places where there really wasn't very much of it, and there were other prairie plants. And again, I kind of wanted the crew to basically, if you felt that you couldn't spray it because you would get spray on prairie species, and I said, well, let's just skip those areas. I'll deal with those some other way. I've actually, at that side, 1 year ago, I actually pulled a patch of crown vetch by hand, just pulled it out by hand. It took me about 4 or 5 hours, but that patch is pretty much gone. It was a little bit of it came back this year, and again, it was sprayed a little bit then this year, and now it's pretty much gone. So I know that pulling will work if you've got the time and there's not too much of it. It does work. It's very effective, and that's the most selective way, of course, to do it. This patch that I was pulling, the reason I pulled it was because it was really intermixed with a lot of lead plant, and it was just going to be impossible to really try and spray the crown vetch without spraying it, but or even mow it without mowing off the lead plant. But I'm very pleased, very hopeful. Now time will tell. Um, I guess you might say wise enough to realize that it may not be completely gone, which it is not completely gone. There's surely a seed bank there, but what was looking very dire, and I was getting very worried and concerned and frustrated. I'm very much more pleased, I guess, and relieved, and a sense of, well, okay, I think the prairie is actually going to be saved now, because the crown vetch that worked. That worked very effectively. That the crown vetch is just those big patches, as I said, just completely gone. You can't see it. So what I'm going to do now is um, obviously keep very vigilant eye on that, and every year I'm going to burn it next spring, and I know that could help to invigorate any crown vetch that's there, or invite crown vetch to come from the seed bank. But that's what I want, basically. I want to see where it's at, and I'm going to go back in and spray it again. And I think, again, spraying it during the growing season, that was the big difference. This year, it was June 8th when we sprayed it. Prior times, again, it was way late in the growing season. I was trying to achieve that protection to the native prairie species. And did we kill some native prairie species? I'm sure that we got some of this spray on some prairie species. I know I did. And I realized one thing that one could do, and I'll do this next time, is carry a large water bottle of just water. And if you realize you just sprayed something you shouldn't have, I think it might be helpful just to quick, douse that plant, those leaves with some water, and try and rinse that herbicide off. That would at least be give it some hope, I guess, of not being killed. But yeah, I'm sure we probably had some collateral damage there, but I think it came to the point where it was that, or risk losing more of the prairie because the crown vetch was just getting worse. And as it gets worse, I mean, there's no prairie in the really thick patches of it. So you're going to lose prairie plants that way too. So what I'm going to do is burn it, as I said, in these places where there were large patches. I'm going to seed in prairie species. I'm going to come up with make a seed mix that represents the species that are there, and get some native species planted in these areas that were overtaken by crown vetch and buckthorn. And because I think ultimately, of course, that's what you got to do is you got to get prairie plants in there to take up that space, of course, and help prevent those species from coming back.
Jennifer's additional comment, I haven't had luck pulling it. My patch keeps growing larger each year. I will keep at it a bit more than. Very good information. So question I had is the crossbow that you used, when was that sprayed? When was that applied? Did you say in early summer?
It was June 8th.
Okay. All right.
And what was happening then, the crown vetch was really, it was just beginning to flower. I think there were some plants that were showing some signs of flowers. It's definitely on the early end of its flowering, which, I think, and again, that was a date to some extent that was determined by the availability of the Conservation Corps crew. If I had my own choice there, I probably would have done it just a little bit later to again help try and correspond with the more of the peak physiological growth and activity time when it's more flower, but it seemed to work just fine.
Okay. And question, so crossbow and milestone that you mentioned, Josh, we were looking at this buffer strip around a water body. Are those two herbicides safe to use around a water body?
Both of them, I know that milestone, I believe, has some water restrictions. I don't know for sure about crossbow. Crossbow's got 2,4-D and triclopyr, so I'm not 100% sure about that one. What kind of water restrictions would be present there? But that's something you'd have to check on for sure if they were going to try and use it in that type of environment there.
Okay. And Jennifer had also mentioned management of reed canary grass.
Well, I'm doing, if you want to see something really amazing, I can take you to my study site in Madison County, where I'm working on a sedge meadow and trying to see the best approach for renovating, again, a sedge meadow, because it is a remnant sedge meadow. It's still there. It's just very suppressed by reed canary grass. So the strategy here is what works best for removing reed canary grass without killing the sedge meadow plants. And what I'm seeing there is a combination of burning, spring burn, and that spring burn ideally would be after the reed canary grass has come up and is have probably had at least a couple of weeks of growth, but you still have enough fuel to carry a fire, of course, so that you're having a significant setback on the reed canary grass. Then, I mean, it is getting top killed and it has to regrow from the root system. So again, every time you top kill something and it has to regrow from the root system, which perennial plants will do, of course, but what you're doing is you're accomplishing a weakening of the root system, and by cumulatively weakening the root system, that makes it easier to kill outright. And because to kill the plant, you have to kill those roots. And so what we're seeing is the combination of spring burn followed by an application of clethodim is working very well to remove reed canary grass. This site is owned by John and Sherry Pauley. They would be more than happy to have visitors come and take a look at what's been going on there. Now, I'm in the third year of treatment there, so it's been 3 applications of this. Spring fire followed by clethodim. The clethodim is sprayed about 2 weeks later. You want to spray the clethodim when the reed canary grass is about 6 to 10 inches tall or so, the regrowth. You can't wait too long with clethodim and let the plants get too much bigger than that, because it won't work as well. Clethodim works by interfering with fatty acid metabolism, and ultimately has this effect basically in reducing the ability for the meristems in grasses to function. So it reduces meristem activity. Grasses grow from basal meristems. Well, I shouldn't say basal, but well, they're basal as far as the internodes go. So there's meristems at the base of the internodes of grass stems, and those meristems are responsible for then growth. Meristems produce lots of cells by mitosis, and that's what makes growth then. So what you're doing is you're stopping that from happening. The herbicide is interfering with the meristems to function, and it just stops the growth of the plants, the shoot growth. And if the shoots can't grow, then they can't feed the roots. So, and it's just the great thing about clethodim again is that it's only effective on grasses. And I can't explain why it doesn't do the same thing to other plants, but probably because of the way the meristems are, because the meristems in other plants are different, located in a different place. They're located in the axils of leaves. But and the great thing about clethodim and sedge metals is that there's enough difference between grasses and sedges. They're in different families, of course, that clethodim has no effect on sedges. So what we're seeing in my plots at this site that I encourage anyone to come visit, just let me know if you want to go see it, is the plots that were sprayed and burned. Again, the spring burn followed by clethodim. There's virtually no reed canary grass, and there's just sedges and forbs everywhere. It's truly kind of remarkable because you can look right next door to a control plot, and it's just 6-foot high reed canary grass. That's what that other plot looked like 3 years ago. And it's now completely transformed. So there's, I think, pretty good evidence. I've got data that shows this, but I don't need to show you numbers. You can come and see it for your own eyes. That's the best way to see it, of course. It's working very well. Now, the only drawback and the reason for I got 7 different treatments I'm trying there is that clethodim kills grasses. Well, so that means it could also kill prairie cordgrass, or it could kill blue joint grass, which are 2 native grasses that grow in sedge meadows. And that will happen. Again, but again, so you got this tough decision. Well, you do you want to suffer a little bit of collateral damage to get rid of the reed canary grass, and then try to put those species back in? I'm using another treatment, which we mow the plots, and then we put the clethodim on. We mow them 3 times during the summer, and then we put clethodim on in the fall, in September. And my strategy there was that maybe by doing that, the blue joint, the native grass, after being mown 3 times, it will, and now we're in September, it's ready just to shut down. It's not going to come back after that 3rd mowing very much. Whereas reed canary grass, again, not being native and being more vigorous and more, again, a cultivar that's designed to grow basically as much as possible, will come back. And so maybe there'll be a difference then in September, that the reed canary grass is much more prevalent than what the blue joint is. And since the blue joint's not growing, it won't it won't be affected by the herbicide then as much. So that's my hope. I don't have enough data yet to say that's true, but that's one of the strategies that I hope might show some promise. I don't think it's going to be as effective. It's clearly not going to be as effective as the spring burn and clethodim, but it might be effective enough to work if you don't want to spray the clethodim because you've got too much native grass.
Jennifer has a follow-up question, and that is, how would you tell a homeowner with a small prairie patch, how would you tell them how to control reed canary grass, or what would be the best way?
Oh, if it's just a small patch, well, if it's small enough just to spray with a backpack sprayer, I mean, I would consider that. That's even more selective, of course. You can really be selective about what you hit. But I mean, if that's something they don't want to do, and some landowners who may be more adverse to herbicides, one of our other treatments is simply mowing. Just mow it 3 times. Now that one, again, is not working as well, but we're seeing some certainly reduction in the amount of reed canary grass. And again, it's kind of just common sense understanding again how plants grow. I mean, if you mow it often enough, and the regrowth, excuse me there. If and the regrowth gets mown and the regrowth gets mown, you're going to weaken it. That plant cannot continue to live if it can't feed the root system. That kind of strategy, you have to be persistent and keep after and keep mowing it then. And of course, when you do that, you're mowing off other things too. So I mean, you're mowing off good plants, I suppose. But if it's just reed canary grass and that's all it is, then of course you don't have to worry about that. I would, I guess more the simplest thing, if you don't want to spray it, is just mow the heck out of it. 4 or 5 times in one growing season, and it'll take longer to kill it, for sure, probably, but I think over time you certainly will, because a plant can't live if it can't do photosynthesis.
And when you say mowing it, you're specifically saying mowing the area that has the reed canary grass rather than the whole prairie
Right.
area. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
quite sure if we're talking about just a patch of it in a prairie. That would work the best then, because you could target that patch. And then this is anecdotal information, but Doug Shealy, who manages Chautauqua Bottoms Greenbelt, told me, and I've seen it for myself, that over the years they're seeing that when the trails that they mow out there, the trails go through areas of reed canary grass, but they mow these trails, repeatedly during the growing season. And what they're seeing is the trail is becoming overrun with sedges, and there's no reed canary grass. There's reed canary grass adjacent to the trails where they're not mowing, but by mowing it repeatedly over the years, that seems to have had certainly much more of a negative effect on reed canary grass than on the sedges. So that's anecdotal, but it suggests the same thing, that persistent mowing over several years it seems to be one thing that would work.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Well, Noah, I think we're ready to start up the next prairie spot at Ada Hayden.
Here we are on the west side of Ada Hayden Heritage Park. It's, if you're familiar with Ames, this is right along Hyde Avenue, northwest part, or straight north side of Ames. And what we're standing here in now is an area that was recently ceded to prairie in the summer of 2017. With 55 different native prairie species. But prior to that, it was a hayfield. It was clover, and we contracted with an individual, and he would come and hay it every summer. But there was an agreement with him that, hey, when we want to seed it to prairie, when the money was available, we would go ahead and seed it. So we went ahead and seeded with the help of Story County Conservation. Joe Quaker and his staff helped us seed it. But it's basically we mowed it a few times in that summer, and then also in 2018 we mowed it, but we haven't done a burn yet. As you can see, there's a lot of color right now, but we really need to burn it. We were going to try to burn it this last spring, but the weather was not necessarily conducive for that. I'm going to turn it over to Tom Rosburg, and he's going to give us a little more information about it.
All right, so yeah, Josh said, you can see there's a lot of color out there. We can see a lot of the first wave of prairie species in the planting. There was early successional species, the gray-headed coneflower, the big balm, bergamot. I can see, but there are some later successional species too. I can see a compass plant off to the left over here a ways. So that's a good sign. Yeah, there's a lot of brome and bluegrass in here, so that's a residual effect from when it was a hayfield. I don't see too much clover, which is good, although there's actually some hay right here, alfalfa. So that's always a problem when you go from that kind of perennial herbaceous land cover type into a prairie. Josh, do you remember what was done to prepare this site? Did they use Roundup?
Yeah, so we hit it with Roundup twice, and we probably should have seeded with like a cold pre-season, like a rye species. And we probably could have sprayed it the third time, but the clover was vicious. And after the first season or first 2 years, I was really discouraged. A lot of knotweed. what are they? Yeah, knotweed and some other stuff had come up, and like it's pretty discouraging. But after the third year, it was actually started to show color like this. So it gave me a little hope.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you did at least a couple applications, because usually when you're trying to get rid of the perennial herbaceous cover, clovers and bromes and Timothy grass and Kentucky bluegrass, those forage grasses, usually one application on doesn't work. So that's good at least. It's always probably some going to be in the seed bank, so spraying it's never going to get that. So yeah, those burns, if you're able to get as late spring, I like to say early May roughly, if you could burn it as early May, that will go a long way to coming back with the grass and the brome. And in some cases, with the competition that we have started here, it might really help knock it back quite a bit.
Sorry about all the wind background sound. My little dead cat, which I could have put on the microphone, would have blown off anyway. So, anyone, any questions or comments on the the video at all in the more newly established prairie area at Ada Hayden? If not, we're going to head to Brookside Park.
I'll just say one quick thing, since you couldn't hear me there very well, I guess, because of the wind. But a couple of quick thoughts there. When you're going from a perennial, cool season grass, and with clovers, that's going to even make it worse. Red clover, white clovers. That's about one of the most difficult starting situations for a prairie reconstruction, because you got perennial plants out there, and again, killing them is going to take quite a bit. So that's why I suggested, I told him it was good that they at least did a couple of applications of Roundup. I've discovered, and this was over many years, and I think a lot of other people have, know the same thing, is that one application of Roundup's never going to do it. It will top kill it and make you think that you've perhaps succeeded in killing off that existing ground cover, but it will come back for sure. I've even, at my farm where I live here, I've done 2 applications, and I still see some of it coming back. So, and this is not going to be anything that works for everybody, but I think a lot of county conservations it might, or larger scale it might. One of the best things might be, if you have that kind of starting point, a cool season forage grassland. If there was some way, even if you were to rent it to somebody, somehow just put it into row crops for a couple of years. 1 year of corn, another year of soybeans. It's actually best to go into the prairie after planting soybeans. Boy, you would have a lot less problem with, of course, all that cool season grass, because by then it would be gone. And in some ways, it's actually easier, of course, to put the seed down if you're putting into a former crop field.
Okay. I don't think we have any other questions. So Noah, go ahead. We'll move on to Brookside Park. Hi, so we have moved from Ada Hayden Park to Brookside Park. Joining me is Liz Calhoun. She is an engineer in the Public Works Department with the City of Ames, and she's going to talk about the river restoration project.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, we're here in Brookside Park, and we're taking a look at our stream here. We have a river restoration project going on right now. We have a 40-foot high slope that is failing. It's all exposed and eroding away. We have a couple houses up above that, so we have put this project in the capital improvements plan. And the project will help to restore the waterway, stabilize and restore the slope. And then we have some water quality features as well. We have a new oxbow as part of this project. Our second concept resulted in actually decision to realign portions of the stream away from the steep slope. So we will incorporate an oxbow in the existing river channel, and that oxbow will help to provide some water quality from an existing storm sewer watershed that will come down from the east bank there, and so that's a great feature that we're going to add as an amenity. Um, Primarily what we're doing here is pulling the slopes back and using natural stream bank stabilization techniques, enhancing the areas with native plants, trying to minimize as much as we can the hard armoring. Um, but will be a few areas that we'll have to use maybe some Fleximat or something like that where the slopes are too steep. But we're making an attempt to do the natural solutions here. And so we'll have the oxbow, and then we'll also be narrowing the channel up in the upper reach, a little bit upstream of here. We'll be narrowing the channel, and right now it's widened out, and there's a lot of meandering, so we'll be still keeping the sinuosity, but just trying to define the channel a little bit better and have some floodplain benches in a few areas to try to uh, help to get the water to slow down and get up on those benches a little bit more. Yeah, so we're excited for this project. We've had some great public outreach meetings. We've had a series last summer where we heard back from the public, and they gave us some great feedback. And so we went back to the drawing board this over the winter, and now we have a new preliminary plan that we're ironing out and be hopefully ready to go to construction this winter is our plan. So that's where we are right now.
Liz, question for you is, as far as the vegetation goes, what is the plan in terms of the establishment period and the long-term maintenance?
Yeah, we actually we're going to develop a plan, and we have Confluence landscape architects working with us on getting really trying to make a good and strong effort to get these areas established. So they're identifying the different zones for landscaping, and then we will develop a plan to manage that. We'll probably have a contractor. We'll hire out a contractor the first few years is our plan on this area and some other areas around town, because that establishment period is so critical. So we recognize that'll be a challenge. Um, Part of this site is going to be wooded, so that presents an issue as far as what we can get to grow there. So yeah, we're just gonna try to try to stay with it and manage it as best we can. So
Okay. Were there any unique features, like any concerns about any sensitive fish species, or any bats that you had to work around?
So we will have to, yeah, actually, we don't know exactly the time frame yet. We're in the process of getting our permits, and we have a little bit of a contradiction because the rusty patch bumblebee is also been found in this area, and that's an federally endangered species. So that um, that for that species, construction generally likes they want the construction to be in the summer when the bees aren't nesting in the ground. However, yeah, so it's the opposite season for the bats. We want the construction to happen in the winter for the bats. The time to build and take trees down is better in the winter to help protect the bat habitat. So we're not sure which season will override. As we get our permits, we'll know more about that. So, okay, yeah. So here we have a steep slope. You can see we've got a fence put up here because the steep slope has been eroding away from the bank, and we have a path, a shared use path, probably about 5 feet from the top of the slope, and it might even be undermined a little bit. So you can see the need for having to regrade this slope, and actually the plan is to remove this particular path. There's been a new path built farther away from the creek, so we can grade this all out and get like 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 slope on this area, and also provide a lot more accessibility to the creek. Right now, the public doesn't really see the creek except for at our bridges, and so we're trying to get much more engagement with the waterway.
Okay, anyone, any questions or comments on the stream restoration project? The proposed, well, it's proposed in its planning stages, near final planning stages. Anyone, any questions or comments? Okay, if not, we're going to keep rolling here. Noah, if you
Okay, now we're up in part of our woodland area, kind of upstream from the creek project. But we do have a little area that we've identified as an area that we want to establish. Some of the trees have come down in the last few years with a path relocation project and the derecho that moved through, and so we have an area that's opened up to the sun, and so we'd like to plant um, some some natives there that will like that area. The invasives have kind of dominated as the extra additional sunlight has come in, and so yeah, we're hoping to get a good plant palette figured out and get that area established, and it's right along our path, which the public uses a lot. So we're really excited about kind of educating people as they pass through here and um, getting that area to grow. I'm going to pass it over to Tom to.
Yeah, so we're looking at this area here. I don't know if you need the mic, maybe, huh?
So we have mic transfer going on here.
Yes, as Liz was saying, it's definitely got a weedy character to it here, especially with the burdock. There's a lot of burdock in here. That's something that will need to be removed. And even some of the native things like yellow wood sorrel right here. It's a native plant, but it's definitely a weedy species. Some of the goldenrods tend to be somewhat weedy. Well, this is giant goldenrod here. Some of the plants that would be examples of what would like to be here are native are the bellflower, tall bellflower. This is usually in a forest environment that's got a little more sun. And although forest is what we're standing in as a whole, because of the extra light along this trail right here, this is more of a woodland environment. So it's a good example of how a woodland environment can be a part of a larger forest because of the trail and the trees that have been removed to put the trail in. There is a lot more light here, and um, some other species that would be good to include. Here's an example of a native sedge that likes to be in floodplain forests and a woodland edge, perhaps. This is called Gray's sedge, Carex grayi. It's a pretty distinctive sedge, kind of nice look to it. A very cespitous or clump forming sedge with these heads, flower heads. These are called perigynia, these large inflated sac-like structures. Each of these are perigynia that surround a fruit that was formed by, of course, the female flower that forms the fruit. Inside each of those is a fruit containing one seed. There's a plant a little bit further this way that apparently has been planted somehow. They've got years of planting it is how that happens. This one right here is everyone will recognize as purple coneflower, something that gets planted in a lot of gardens, and that's fine. But in an environment like this, it's not really appropriate because this is not native to Story County. This particular species of coneflower is, as far as we can tell, which is it's always difficult to be sure exactly what the native range was, of course, but uh, based on the vouchers we got and the records we got, was native only to the basically the southeastern, roughly maybe 1/5 of Iowa or so, from south central to southeast up into east central Iowa. This is a species of white vervain, which is a native species, and again, pretty much in the right environment, kind of woodland edge, woodland species, can grow us also in more open grassland environments. But another example of a less conservative species that does also to me, say this is kind of a disturbed area.
Tom, what about right behind you?
Oh, this grass right here, this is an excellent example of a grass species. This is bottlebrush grass that would be appropriate in an open woodland environment like this or savanna. So I don't know if, again, if it is something that was planted here. Has there been any planting going on here?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not yet, anyway. So it might be, again, a native population here that's responded to the light.
So Tom, in the city of Ames looking at, and the Friends of Brookside Park looking at establishing, wanting to invest in some native species in the woodland, do you have any suggestions, maybe not so much on specific species, but general species that they might consider?
I do, and I like to tell people that if you're planning to do a seeding, a planting, whether it's a prairie planting or a woodland planting, forest planting, whatever it might be, um, to me, the first important rule is make sure you choose species native to your county. So you ought to be trying to represent what was here. If you're trying to do a restoration, restoration should always be aimed at populations and systems that were here. So, and it's important for a lot of other reasons in terms of native species, because if you bring species in that are not native, you're moving them outside of their range, and you're kind of then putting them into an environment where they will have interactions with other species that they haven't evolved with. And so that's usually a recipe for disaster. That's basically what happens when invasive species become a problem. They've moved a lot farther, but they've moved outside of their native range into a new place, North America, for example, and left all of their species they evolved with behind. And now they're in an environment, in a situation where they don't have any species that naturally have evolved to control them. So that can happen even with native species to North America, moving them from one state to another in a sense, or from southeast Iowa to northwest Iowa. It doesn't have to be halfway around the world. Just moving them outside of their native range puts them in an environment again where things aren't normal in a way. So that's always my first rule. Determine what species are native. Then, of course, of that list, determine which species are correct for the environment. What kind of soil moisture regime are we talking about? Is it a hydric soil, a wet mesic soil, a dry soil? Looking at the floodplain environment here, we would have a situation where we can have standing water here. So you have to take that into account. What kind of moisture or water environment is the site. And then the other part of that environment is the light. How much light are we talking about? Is it a closed environment, where there's a lot of forest cover, and so not much light, or is it a prairie environment where there's a lot of light? Again, you have a gradient there from low to high. So you can kind of picture light and moisture as two factors on a two-dimensional graph in a sense, and figure out where you are in that two two dimensional space. That will then identify which species they're native and they fit the environment and they fit the moisture and the light environment. Those are the correct species, and then it's just a matter of how many of those can you afford and what that list looks like.
I have a question. So, as far as the county species, is there a database available, or how do we find out what's native to our county?
That's a very important question. I'm glad you asked because I should talk about that. It's not always real easy to do that. Now, for prairie species, there is a good resource. It's called Prairie Plants of Iowa. Paul Christensen and Mark Mueller were co-authors of that book. It's available at University of Iowa Press. It's actually available online through University of Iowa, so you can actually see it online in a sense and see the map. The important thing about that book is that Paul Christensen endeavored to represent the native range of species by showing a map of Iowa with all the counties and putting dots in places where vouchers, known collections were seen, were observed. He went through the herbaria records at Iowa State, you and I, U of I think, at the time. Of course, Rosburg was still down there at that time, and looked at vouchers and tried to, again, by looking at vouchers that have been collected prior to, say, roughly 1960, I suppose. That's roughly the date I would probably use if I were doing it. Um, you can be pretty certain that you're looking at a native population because plants weren't being moved and planted very much before 1960. So um, if you see a plant collected, 1955 or something like that, that's a plant that has always been growing there in a sense. Now that's not always true because plants have been moved around so much, and so if you have a plant that's has a voucher and a record of 2015, well, maybe it's native, but maybe someone moved it there too and put it there, so it's not so clear. So again, that resource is available for prairie plants, has about 150 prairie plants in it, so it's really good. Now for forest or woodland plants, that kind of resource doesn't exist, unfortunately. And so I again tell people, as because I am so uh, dedicated, I guess, to getting things right in terms of the native biogeography. I will help anyone who needs some help in determining what species are native. There are some other resources that I have available that aren't easy to direct people to. So that's probably the best way to approach it. I mean, you can go out and look at forests, and I guess I get some idea of things that are, but there's always going to be some questions, I think, for some species.
Okay.
And Noah, go ahead and just finish up the video, and then I see we have another question in the chat, but let's just finish up the video for now. Thanks.
Now we're farther upstream. We're at a northern pedestrian bridge here on the Iowa Creek, and you can see that we have a very wide channel here. We're planning to narrow this channel, at least the outsides down, so that we have kind of a more defined waterway and floodway. We'll be filling in on the opposite side here, and then reworking the thowweg coming into this bridge, vegetating it, and hopefully not taking down too many trees to do it, because our plan is to work in the channel and just move the material around within the channel. Okay, now we're over in the area where our oxbow will be. This is the existing stream, which will be relocated to the west. And so we have a pipe outlet just across the stream here, which will discharge into the oxbow, providing water quality. And then just downstream from here is our steep slope. It's partially viewable right now, but it's about a 40-foot high slope that's less than, steeper than a 1-to-1 in many places. So that's what we will be pulling the stream away from.
Okay, sorry about the background sound. I realized on this one that I was working with you can't call it a tripod, a camera pod, because it's a single pod, and you were hearing me dragging it across. Obviously, it picks up the sound anytime I move that on the ground. It picked up sound. So sorry about that, everyone. But let's see. So Tom, Jen has another question. Have you ever dealt with an infestation of creeping Charlie into a prairie from adjacent lawn? Any thoughts on the control of that? I wondered if fire would be the best approach.
I cannot say I've done that or had to deal with that in a prairie environment. I've seen that happen in places, but I didn't have anything to do with trying to remove it, of course. The only experience I have with Creeping Jenny or Creeping Charlie, I'm sorry, Creeping Charlie is in a lawn, basically, like everyone else probably, and use herbicides in the fall there to try to remove it. In a prairie environment, fire would probably be helpful. Just thinking about it off the top of my head, I think again, I'd probably try to do it as late as possible into the late summer or late spring, early summer time frame. With fire and using fire to accomplish certain goals, it's always about timing for the most part. It's choosing the right time to do the burn. And again, I think that's probably going to be somewhat true there. But by using a late spring, early summer, I think that would probably do put the most hurt or damage on it. Um, it'll probably come back, being a perennial plant, but this is an important point, I think, to stress. I think this is somewhat true probably with Creeping Charlie, because it's a plant that would begin growth early in the growing season. And same thing is true for smooth brome. And I can speak to smooth brome because I've actually done work on it and counted it. But by burning in the late spring, and by late spring I mean May, generally maybe the first part of May to middle part of May, that is the best time to try to put stress on some of the spring species that you don't want, like smooth brome or Creeping Charlie, perhaps, that have been growing for a couple of weeks. Because again, you're going to hurt it at a time when it's already removed some of the resources from its root system and invested in top growth and shoot development. So top killing it then, yes, being perennial, it will come back. But now, there's an important point. It's coming back at a different time. It's coming back at a time when the biotic environment is going to be quite a bit different. When it first came up early in the spring, it was probably one of the first things that came up. And so no competition. But now when it comes back, say towards the middle to the end part of May, if you actually do have a prairie, have a decent prairie there or prairie planting, there's going to be a lot of other prairie plants that are already up and are responding to that burn as well in a more favorable way. And I just think, the competitive environment is going to be a lot different then. And that's a part, I think, of the success in removing a species like that is changing the competitive environment to favor the native species. So, I mean, I can't say from any kind of experience with it, but I guess if I had that problem, that's probably what I would try to see if that worked. If it didn't work very well, then herbicide, but that's going to be a little bit harder one to try to spray probably. Depends upon just how dense and thick it is, I guess. But I would definitely try the fire.
Hey, another question. Oh, go
I
ahead.
just a quick say, another reason for doing that and saying is that again, I have this philosophy that prairie species have evolved with fire over millennia. Non-native, non-prairie species have not. And so to me, it just kind of makes common sense. If you're trying to separate prairie from non-prairie, fire should be a good tool.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that.
This makes sense.
Question from Karen: how do you recommend controlling sweet clover in our parks prairie restorations?
Well, what I do for sweet clover is definitely do not let it ever go to seed. So I'm out mowing it. Yellow blooms earlier than white, so beware of that. I've got a few little patches that we need to go out and probably this afternoon when we get done here, actually go out and mow. And I'm talking about mowing with brush cutter. Now, I've had bigger patches and I mow those with a tractor. So again, your tool depends upon the amount, I guess, you have to mow and whether or not you can get a tractor in there or not. But that works pretty well because I've been fighting sweet clover on my prairie plantings here on my farm and places where I get a crop of it growing. Remember, it's a biennial generally, so the first year it generally doesn't, just grows as a smaller plant, and the second year it flowers. Mowing it that second year again to prevent any seed being produced is what's important, and I've seen when I've done that, it seems to disappear from those sites. So I sometimes get another patch popping up someplace else, especially after I do a burn. And that's to be expected because it will respond to a burn if there's seed in the soil seed bank. Just a real quick story. Way back when Ames High Prairie was sort of being managed by the local friends of Ames High Prairie, there was a really bad sweet clover problem on that prairie. And I was a graduate student at that time, and so I, with some others, sort of planned this strategy. We decided, well, what we would do is we did a burn there in March to encourage the sweet clover to germinate from the seed bank, and that definitely was true. It germinated very well. And then we came, and that was all just first year growth, though. I think, obviously there could have been some second year plants. I don't remember if we went out and tried to cut those or what. But the point was is that on a larger scale, we took an early spring fire to germinate a bunch of it to get the first year plants growing, and then the following year we followed up with another burn. There had been enough fuel produced on the site to support another burn, but this burn was done in May, first part of May. And so the second year growth of the sweet clover was coming up through the litter, and the fire top killed all of that, and that stuff did not come back. We had to go in and cut a few patches by hand that didn't burn very well because there wasn't a solid, dense layer of fuel there. But that worked, and that was a fairly large patch. It was something that was probably more than could be done by hand. We covered a fair amount of the southwest facing slope there at Ames High Prairie. That was very effective. I mean, you can go. There's no sweet clover there now. Of course, that was a long time ago, but I remember just the years after that, there was a noticeable reduction there. So that's kind of the strategy that I use out here on my farm too. Use fire to find it, get it to grow, and then kill the second year plants if possible, or prevent them from producing any seed. Again, as a biennial, I mean, it has to. Only way it persists on the site is if it's able to make seed.
Okay. And we have a question from Liz. Can you explain more about the fire effect on native versus non-native plants?
Well, so that's a good question. And any perennial plant, is going to have the same problem surviving fire, in a sense, in terms of if a fire occurs when it's growing, the heat produced by a fire is going to kill any herbaceous plant. It's going to top kill any herbaceous plant. Prairie plants are not any more special than non-native plants in that sense. They're both herbaceous plants. They're both going to be top killed by that heat. The question is, how well does that plant respond to that top killing? How deep and rich, you might say, how well protected are its root systems? Because that part of the plant, of course, is what survives, and that's what comes back. The root systems are able to provide the energy to provide growth of new shoots after the fire. And I guess my thinking is that simply, again, plants that have evolved with fire have evolved with this problem of being top killed. And quite often, and honestly, again, thinking about when fires actually occurred through the millennia that plants actually evolved to, those fires occurred in late summer, the last half of the growing season from July through early September. So, and that's an important part of how an explanation, I guess you might say, for the ability for what we would call the ability for prairie plants to be adapted to fire, is that they had to experience it during the growing season when they were actively growing. If an organism is not really present in the environment when something happens, the something that happens, it can't respond. It's not going to respond to that because it has to actually be present for natural selection to occur. The same idea works really well with when you think about insects and why insects really don't show very much in the way of strategies for adaptation to fires, because most insects have life cycles in which they only live for a year. And so in most cases, when a fire even was occurring just once every 3 or 4 years on the native landscape, the large majority of insect populations would never experience a fire. So in a sense, they can't really evolve a strategy to deal with it if they don't experience it. So going back to plants again, it's my thinking that because of the deep root systems that prairie plants establish, and part of that could have been their adaptation to fire, part of it could be adaptation to periodic drought. But lots of prairie landscapes, don't ever get that dry. The eastern part of the tallgrass prairie certainly doesn't. So, but still, periodic drought is still always a possibility. The further you go west, of course, the drier it gets, and so deeper root systems become more important there. But the point again being that by responding to fire in a way that provided them a ready reserve, a strong reserve of food storage and root systems to come back after repeated top killing. I mean, they could be top killed by a fire, but they could also be top killed later by a bison or elk that comes along and grazes them off. I mean, I kind of use that same strategy when I use mowing, because mowing is a way of essentially doing what fire does, but doing it whenever you want to. If you mow something off, you're going to top kill it. And again, it's just my thinking that, and I can't point to proof, I guess, or data necessarily, but plants that are adapted to fire, they're adapted to being top killed. They're better. They're going to be stronger and more vigorous in that type of environment than something that hasn't. And so if we're dealing with plants that are coming from Northern Europe or someplace where fire was not a part of their evolutionary history, then, in some ways they wouldn't have sort of that natural adapted characteristic of having deep-rooted root systems in soil. And that's true for a lot of for example, brome grass and Kentucky bluegrass. Their roots are not deep at all. Their roots are very shallow. So, I mean, that's the best I can do, I think, is just say that thousands to millions of years, really, of course, because prairie's been around for several million years. Grasslands in North America have been around for probably at least 30 million years. And fire has been an important part of that entire time. Having an evolutionary history with fire is going to make them, better equipped to deal with fire because of their deep roots.
Okay. And one last question. This actually, well, we might have another one coming. We'll see. Is in controlling cool season grasses, pasture type grasses with fire, controlling them with fire, when is the best time to burn?
Well, I can answer that one pretty easily because there is abundant research, and I've done some of this myself to corroborate other research. I mean, I could pull up a bunch of scientific papers that point to, if you're dealing with cool season non-native grasses, the typical brome, bluegrass, fescue, orchard grass, timothy grass, the grass that's probably been studied the most is smooth brome because it's everywhere. And that's the same with the study I did in Story County. Clearly, the first part of May, you want to go when the grass is what's called in the boot stage. So the boot stage is when the inflorescence, which is the part of the plant that produces the flowers, is where the flowers are. The inflorescence of the grass is beginning to form. It's not yet visible. It's hidden down in the leaves, a bunch of leaves that are forming as well. And those leaves surround that inflorescence. You can sometimes tell the boot stage because at the top of the plant, it looks like the stem, but it's actually these leaves and inflorescence beginning to form. It's really spongy and kind of thick. So plants that are in this inflorescence forming stage, basically, is what that means. Has been shown to be, again, a very susceptible time to the top killing that occurs then. The fire is just going to top kill them, just like it's going to top kill the prairie plants. But again, it's the inability for the brome to respond well to that through its lack of evolution with fire. And also, I think, because of the shallow root systems, there could be some damage to those roots because some of the heat of the fire will go into the soil, maybe not much more than an inch or so. But then the other thing that's important, I mentioned earlier too, is that if there's a prairie environment there, then when that brome comes back from the root systems, because this is a perennial plant, it's coming back at a time when the native grasses that are also there are much more vigorous and much more competitive. That's the problem, is the non-natives have this early advantage over the natives because they're being cool season grasses. They begin growth in April. So they get a head start on the native grasses. And if you don't do something to fix that, then again, you will continually have problems with these non-native grasses. But yeah, data shows clearly early part of May works the
Okay.
best.
Thank you. And so both Liz and Jennifer ask, thank you very much for the great information. So,
Welcome.
so
Anything to help?
yeah, great ideas, great suggestions. So we're coming up on the end of our third webinar. We have one more to go in August. And should we leave them in suspense on where we're going, or should we tell them?
Oh, I think we should tell them, because I guess I wouldn't say we're saving the best for last, but it is a pretty cool place. If you've never been to White Rock Conservancy, here's your chance to travel out to White Rock on video, a link, I guess. If you've been there, great, but you've not seen behind the scenes that we're going to be showing you, some of the behind of the scenes work on restoration there. White Rock is out there along the Middle Raccoon River in Guthrie County. It's 5,000 acres of pretty wild landscape. A lot of restoration happening there with savanna, woodland, and prairie. There's some neat wetland seeps out there. So a lot to see.
Okay, so we're gonna have a lot of fun with that one, and I'll try and figure out my tripod issues the next time. So, and Tom, back up a little and let us figure out which NFL team you're a fan of. There it is, Green Bay Packers. Go
100%.
Packers. I'm from Wisconsin too, so I think we're gonna get comments coming in now. Woohoo is what I heard.
Oh, a whole bunch of booze, huh?
No booze, but a woohoo. So.
Oh, ooh, okay, some other Packer fans. All right.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Happy to have you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Noah, behind the scenes and getting our video going. So we'll see you next time in August. We're going to have a lot of fun with this. So take care, everyone. Have a nice day.